everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bells that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about the solved case of Nikki Kuhnhausen. She was a young trans woman from Vancouver and she just mysteriously disappeared one day in mid-2019. Tragically, months after Nikki vanished, her remains were found, and this case immediately went from being a missing persons inquiry to a murder investigation, and it soon became pretty clear to the police what her killer's motive was for committing this horrific crime. Well, it was a hate crime. Nikki Kuhnhausen was brutally murdered simply for just being herself, being who she was, which leads me on to say that before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video is about the murder of a transgender teenage girl, and it contains heavy themes such as violence towards the LGBTQ+ community, as well as transphobia and homophobia. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we're going back just under 5 years now to the summer of 2019 in Vancouver, which is a city located in Clark County in the state of Washington in the US. And this is Nikki Kuhnhausen. She was a 17-year-old girl who lived in Vancouver. Nikki was born on the 6th of July 2001. Her mother was named Lisa, and unfortunately I couldn't find the name of her father anywhere. I know that her stepfather was called Vincent, and I believe Nikki had 2 brothers. She may have had more siblings, but I could only find the names of 2 brothers online. Their names were Conrad and Alex. And life for Nikki and her siblings wasn't always easy growing up. They didn't always have the most stable childhood. Her parents split when Nikki was just a young child, and apparently her dad had spent some time in prison whilst their mother had a period where she struggled with substance abuse. So this meant that the kids were kind of in and out of foster care a lot growing up, but despite this, Nikki still grew up to be very close to her parents, especially her mother Lisa. Lisa described how when Nikki was a teenager, they would always do fun things together. So like they would go and get their nails done and go shopping, just fun mother and daughter stuff like that. They had a very, very close bond. Now, as I mentioned, Nikki was transgender. She was assigned male at birth. However, I mean, her family knew from a very young age that Nikki would probably want to explore her gender identity. She was as young as just 5 years old when she started showing interest in like wigs and dresses and more, I suppose, stereotypically girly stuff like the colour pink and Disney princesses and makeup. She would enjoy playing with her mum's makeup and trying on her high heels. She was said to have absolutely idolised TV characters like Hannah Montana. And Nikki's parents were really the best kind of parents that a child like Nikki could have had, because they never tried to like steer her away from liking girly stuff and try to influence her to have, again, more stereotypically boyish hobbies. They just accepted her for who she was. If she wanted to wear dresses, she could wear dresses. If she wanted to experiment with makeup, she could do that. If she wanted to be a girl, she could be a girl. They loved her for who she was. To them, she was just Nikki. And so, with the support from her family, Nikki started publicly identifying as a girl when she was in the 6th grade, so around 11 to 12 years old. Prior to this, she would keep it pretty private, only being her true self at home with her family. But yeah, when she was in the 6th grade, she felt ready to show the world who she really was too. And for the most part, it seemed as though for Nikki, this thankfully came with a lot of love and acceptance. I mean, sources state that there was a little bit of bullying at school, but Nikki was not the type to just take it. She would stand up for herself. She wasn't afraid to put the bullies in their place and demand the respect that she deserved, and she would always stand up for other trans people too. She always had a lot of friends in school. A lot of the girls in school would always ask Nikki to do their makeup because she was very talented at makeup. In fact, her dream was to become a makeup artist when she was older. That was the career path that she wanted to go down. But she didn't want to be just any makeup artist. No, no, no. She wanted to be the makeup artist for her idol, Nicki Minaj. She adored Nicki Minaj so much. Nikki Kuhnhausen was described by those that knew her as being a very loving and caring young girl who always had this fire in her belly. She was so strong-willed and fierce. She was confident. She was a lot of fun to be around. She was adventurous and outgoing. She was unstoppable, really. The type of person that could do do anything that she set her mind to. Nikki was very active on social media, as of course a lot of teenagers are. She was always posting online content like videos of her dancing and doing these cool transitions on TikTok and stuff like that. And she did build a bit of a following on social media actually. She had a good few thousand followers. She was just a young girl enjoying herself, enjoying being a teen. However, Nikki did also go through a very troubling period during her teenage years too. A period where she kind of fell in with the wrong crowd and she started to rebel a little bit. She started skipping school and just being quite distant with friends and family. Apparently she could be quite difficult to get a hold of, and she also started using drugs as well, and she got to the point where she was very dependent on them. She was addicted really. She was only about 16 years old at this time and she was addicted to drugs. Her mother Lisa did everything that she could to try and pull her daughter out of this life of substance abuse. She tried on many occasions to get Nikki to get help and go to rehab, but she was unsuccessful. And things took a really terrifying turn in regards to Nikki's drug use when in 2018 she was actually shot with a gun 6 times, I believe as a result of some kind of drug dispute. Miraculously, Nikki survived this attack. Despite the amount of gunshot wounds that she sustained, thankfully they weren't life-threatening. Obviously she had to spend quite a bit of time in hospital recovering, but she was going to be okay, no severe damage done. Unfortunately, the person who shot Nikki wasn't convicted, but something positive which did come out of this was that it seemed to be the kind of push that Nikki needed to sort her life out and to stop hanging around with the wrong crowd who had been such a bad influence on her. And by the summer of the following year, the summer of 2019, it would appear as though Nikki was trying to get her life back on track. She was going back to her old, happy, bubbly, outgoing self, but then she just suddenly disappeared, completely out of the blue. It was the 5th of June 2019, a day that initially seemed to be like any other for 17-year-old Nikki Kuhnhausen. That evening, she'd been sending messages to her mum, Lisa, on Facebook. She didn't actually live with her mum at this point. From what I can gather, Nikki was staying with her father occasionally in the lead up to her disappearance, and she would also kind of couch surf at friends' houses, or she shared a place with some roommates. But regardless, she was still in regular contact with her mum because they were so close. They would speak and text each other every single day. And as I said, they were exchanging messages on the evening of the 5th of June. They said goodnight to each other, I love you, and said that they would speak tomorrow. However, tomorrow rolled around and there was nothing. Lisa received no contact from her daughter whatsoever. Lisa was trying to call Nikki and send her messages, but she wasn't getting any answer, and nor were her friends. Her friends were texting Nikki too, but she just wasn't replying. And not only was she not replying, but she also wasn't like actually seeing the messages or clicking on them. You know how you can tell on your phone when the person you're texting has read what you put through read receipts? Well, Nikki wasn't even reading the messages, let alone responding to them, which was pretty unusual for her, given the fact that she was always on her phone, always active on social media. I mean, I don't think that Lisa started necessarily panicking too much at first, because at the end of the day, Nikki was 17 and she was a very independent young girl, so she wasn't overly concerned initially. Maybe she was just busy, maybe she'd lost or misplaced her phone or something. In fact, Nikki was known for that, always losing her phone. And actually, I think the phone that she was using at the time that this case occurred was borrowed. She was borrowing a friend's phone because she'd lost hers. So yeah, it wasn't unlike her to misplace it. But at the same time, there was something there. It was like mother's intuition almost. Lisa just had this gut feeling that something may have been wrong. A couple of days passed with still no word from Nikki. Not only was she not responding to calls or messages, but she also wasn't posting on any of her social media accounts. They were just radio silent. And so on the 10th of June 2019, Nikki's mother contacted the Vancouver police and she reported her daughter as missing. So the search for Nikki Kuhnhausen began, and it wasn't long before Nikki's case had hit the media. Missing posters with Nikki's face on were created and distributed. The local news were reporting on her disappearance. Her family appeared on the news to appeal for information, and this did result in potential sightings of her being reported to the police. However, as it would turn out, they were all dead ends. These these sightings were not of Nikki. Meanwhile, of course, Nikki's family were all just sick with worry, especially her mother Lisa. She was just so terrified and anxious that at one point, whilst her daughter was missing, she actually had to be admitted to a mental health facility because she just could not cope. She couldn't cope with not knowing where Nikki was and if she was okay or if she was in danger somewhere. Now, as part of the police investigation, detectives were obviously speaking to and taking statements from pretty much everyone in Nikki's life, and this included the friends that she was staying with at the time that she disappeared, her roommates, and her roommates were able to tell the police that on the night that she disappeared, in the early hours of the 6th of June, the last time that they saw Nikki was when she left the house to go and meet a man that she had been chatting to online. And when the police gained access to Nikki's social media accounts and they had a look through her Snapchat messages, this could be confirmed. They found that on the day that she vanished, Nikki had been messaging a man named David Bogdanov, who was about 8 years older than her. He was 25 when this case occurred, and obviously she was only 17. But yeah, they'd been exchanging messages about arranging to meet up on the night that she went missing. And so, of course, the detectives were very interested in speaking with David Bogdanov and finding out what he knew about Nikki's disappearance. Did he potentially have involvement in whatever had happened to her? And so they began trying to contact him, something that would prove very difficult to do, actually. They tried messaging him on his social media accounts asking to speak with him. They tried calling his phone countless times, but they didn't get a response. I believe they even went to his house on a couple of occasions, but he was never there. So the police had to keep leaving him notes asking David to get in touch with them. But it turns out that the reason why he wasn't there was because shortly after Nikki's disappearance, David Bogdanov had actually gone to Ukraine, which of course seemed very suspicious. The fact that he has a connection to this young girl who is now missing, and not long after, he goes missing himself. He leaves the country. Very shady behaviour. But at the same time, I'm assuming that it wasn't like the police could go and get him or anything, because even though he seemed to be potentially the last person to see Nikki, they didn't have any actual evidence that he was involved in her disappearance. So it wasn't like they could force him to come back and arrest him. All they could really do, I suppose, was keep trying to get in touch with him and hope that he would agree to speak with the police and cooperate. And he finally did, but months later, it was more than 3.5 months after Nikki disappeared in late September of 2019, when finally the detectives heard back from David Bogdanov. He finally responded to their messages, basically saying that the reason he had taken so long to get back to them was because he had been having, quote, phone trouble. And he said that he just arrived back in the US after spending about 6 weeks in Ukraine, I think. And so the detectives asked him to come down to the police station so that they could interview him, which he did on the 2nd of October 2019, coming up to 4 months after Nikki vanished. The detectives asked David Bogdanov for his account on the night that Nikki went missing. How was it that he came to meet her? And he said the following. David said that in the early hours of the morning on the 6th of June 2019, he had been out in Vancouver with his brothers drinking, and he claimed that at around 3 in the morning he was driving in his white van alone when he spotted a young girl walking on her own down the street. This young girl was Nikki Kuhnhausen. Now, I don't actually know why Nikki was walking alone so late at night. Maybe this was something that she did often, perhaps. She'd go for a stroll around the block to get some fresh air before going to bed, who knows? But yes, anyway, he said that he saw Nikki walking alone, and so he stopped his van and I think got out of his vehicle, approached Nikki and asked if she was okay. He basically said that he was just trying to be a good guy because, you know, Nikki was a young woman walking alone at night. It was cold outside, so he said that he offered her his jacket. He said that from there they started getting into a conversation. They even had a drink together because David had a bottle of vodka in his car, so he offered Nikki some of that. He even said that she could take the bottle home with her. And then he said that he gave Nikki his Snapchat, so they essentially exchanged contact details, and then Nikki went back home and he drove away. But he said that shortly shortly after Nikki left, they started messaging each other on Snapchat, and they actually arranged to meet up again that same night. Nikki gave David her address, or her friend's address, where she was staying at the time, and he came and picked her up sometime after 5 a.m. Apparently, David told Nikki that he would help her find her phone because, as I said, the phone that Nikki was using at the time of her disappearance wasn't actually hers, it was a friend's. She had recently lost her phone, so he offered to go out and help her find it. So Nikki got into David's van, they were driving around for a while until eventually he parked up in the driveway of his brother's house. They continued chatting, and David claimed that it was then when Nikki told him that she was transgender, she was a trans woman. In his words, he said, quote, "And then she told me that she's not a she." And he said that he was just shocked and uncomfortable and disturbed. He found the fact that she was trans disturbing because he'd been raised to believe that that was wrong, that being transgender was immoral and disgusting, that being a part of the LGBTQ plus community in any way was disgusting. As well as transphobic, he was also homophobic and biphobic, etc, etc. And so he immediately ordered Nikki to get out of his car, which she did, and he drove away, and he said that that was the last he saw of her. The last time he saw Nikki Kuhnhausen, she was alive. So that was David's story from that night, and although I think the police were a little bit skeptical of this story, once again they had no actual evidence to prove that he was responsible for her disappearance, and he didn't have a criminal record or anything. He'd never been involved with the police before, so they were forced to let him go after questioning, and the search for Nikki continued. But unfortunately, once again, months passed and there was still nothing, no contact from Nikki whatsoever and no sign of her, or at least that was until early December of 2019, so 6 months after Nikki's disappearance, when her family received the news that they had been dreading. Human remains had been found. It was the 7th of December 2019 when a hiker was walking through a remote area in Larch Mountain, which is about 25 miles away from Vancouver, and as this hiker was walking down an embankment, he suddenly spotted something on the ground. It looked like a human skull. So he immediately called the police, who began an extensive search of this area in Larch Mountain. They obviously recovered the skull, and they also found other remains belonging to this skeleton, the other bones. They were kind of scattered around because, I mean, as I said, they were skeletal remains, so it was clear that this person had been dead for a while, and animals had clearly descended on the body and carried different parts of the skeleton to different spots on the mountain. But eventually, I think the majority, if not all of the skeleton was recovered, and that wasn't all that the police found at the scene. Nearby, they also found some items of clothing. They found this bright lime green jacket, a watch, a bandana, some underwear, some jewellery like rings and stuff, and also they found what looked like a phone charger, but this phone charger almost looked as though it had been fashioned into a sort of ligature. It had been tied round with a knot, and there were human hair extensions tangled up in this knot. So this seemed very, very eerie, and perhaps gave the police their first insight into how this person may have died. And it didn't take long for the police to realise that this person, this skeleton, may have been Nikki Kuhnhausen's, because of those items that were found near the body. They were able to determine through Nikki's pictures and selfies that she had posted online that these items belonged to her. The police found a picture of her wearing a bright lime green jacket, exactly like the jacket found at the crime scene, and also the rings that were found. The police were able to, again, look at her pictures and find photos where she was wearing these rings, so they were certain that this must have been Nikki. And eventually, dental records confirmed this. Nikki's dental records were compared to the teeth from the skeleton, and sure enough, they were a match. Finally, after more than 6 months of searching, she had been found. But of course, the news that she had been found dead was something that her family never wanted to hear. And what is so heartbreaking is that on the day that Nikki's skeleton was found, on the morning of the 7th of December, her mother Lisa had spent that morning making her daughter a handmade Christmas card, because even though Nikki had been missing for months, Lisa still held out that hope that she would be found alive and that she would be home for Christmas. But shortly after this, she was informed that she wouldn't be, because Nikki had been found dead and she had been the victim of a brutal homicide. It was also confirmed in her autopsy that she had been strangled to death with that phone charger. It really had been used as a ligature to choke her. So what was a missing persons case had now turned into a homicide investigation. And as you can imagine, Nikki's death not only devastated her loved ones, but also the trans community and just the LGBTQ plus community in general in Vancouver. They were just heartbroken and understandably terrified, because the motive for her murder was unclear. Was this a hate crime? Was Nikki murdered by someone purely because she was transgender? If so, what does that mean for other trans people in Vancouver? Were they unsafe? Were they at risk of becoming a victim to the same person who had killed Nikki? Although, as you've probably guessed, the police already had an idea of who that person was who killed Nikki Kuhnhausen. David Bogdanov, the guy who admitted that he'd been with Nikki on the night that she vanished. He said that he ordered her to leave his car once he found out that she was trans and that was the last he saw of her. But was that really true? Did she really leave his car alive that night? I mean, David Bogdanov had already made it clear to the police that trans and queer people disgusted him, so maybe he murdered Nikki because of this, because of transphobia. So following the discovery of Nikki's remains, Bogdanov was brought back to the police station to be questioned once again, and he basically maintained the same story as before. He said that yes, he saw Nikki that night, she'd been in his vehicle, but upon learning that she was transgender, he told her to leave and he never saw her again after this. And he also said that the following morning he went to work as usual. I think he worked in construction in the city of Portland in Oregon, which is just under 10 miles away from Vancouver. However, what David Bogdanov was unaware of when he sat down with detectives for this second interview was that by this point they had obtained his cell phone record, which showed that on the morning of the 6th of June, the same morning that Nikki disappeared and was presumably killed, David Bogdanov had driven east towards Larch Mountain. His phone data showed that he had travelled there that morning, travelled to the same area where Nikki's skeleton was found. And so, eventually, in his second interview, the detective confronted him with this evidence which put him at the crime scene. And his response to this was to ask for a lawyer. He didn't want to speak to the police anymore without one, so clearly he was panicking at this point. He was immediately arrested on suspicion of the murder of Nikki Kuhnhausen, and it was following his arrest when transgender activists launched the Justice for Nikki task force to not only bring attention to Nikki's murder, but also to spread awareness of transphobic hate crimes in general and the chilling statistics surrounding them, such as the fact that trans people are 4 times more likely to be victims of a violent crime in the US than non-trans people. And the fact that in cases such as this one, where a trans person is murdered, the perpetrator is only apprehended and actually convicted about 30% of the time. Only 30% of transgender homicide victims actually receive justice, which is just horrendous. And something else that the Justice for Nikki task force campaigned for following David Bogdanov's arrest was for malicious harassment to be introduced as a criminal offence in Clark County in Washington, which is essentially a hate crime offence. And thanks to their hard work, they were successful with that, and it was introduced. So not only was David Bogdanov eventually charged with second-degree murder in relation to Nikki's case, he was also charged with malicious harassment. David Bogdanov's trial began in August of 2021, more than 2 years after Nikki was killed. I think that COVID probably had a part to play in it being delayed for so long. But yes, his trial began in August of 2021. He pleaded not guilty, and by the time his trial rolled around, David Bogdanov had completely changed his entire story. He actually took to the stand during his trial trial, and he told the courtroom a new version of events from that night. One in which he finally admitted that yes, he did technically kill Nikki, but only because he believed that she was going to kill him. He claimed that this was self-defense. David Bogdanov's new story was that on the night that this case occurred, after picking Nikki up and driving off together, once they were parked up, they eventually started kissing, and he claimed that Nikki asked him to join her in the back seat of his van. He said that they started touching each other in, you know, intimate areas, and he said that that was when he realized that Nikki was transgender, and he said that following this, he just went into a state of shock. He was angry because he felt like Nikki had deceived him, and so he said that he immediately pushed Nikki back away from him and said, quote, "You didn't tell me you were a dude." He then started calling Nikki names, telling her that she was disgusting and, quote, "a piece of crap," and he started yelling at her to leave and get out of his vehicle. But David claimed that instead of getting out, Nikki became aggressive and violent. She started trying to kick David, and he believed that she also began trying to reach for his gun. He carried a gun with him in his car, which was kept in between the passenger seat and the driver's seat, and he said that Nikki jumped up and she kind of reached over to grab this gun, and because he believed that she was going to shoot him, he grabbed his car phone charger, and using it, he tried to restrain her. He said that he was behind Nikki and that he originally looped the phone charger around her shoulders, and he began pulling her back with this phone charger to stop her from reaching forward to get the gun. However, he claimed that during the struggle, the charger cable slipped up to her neck, and this resulted in him accidentally strangling her to death. He told the courtroom that upon realizing that he had killed Nikki, his first thought was to call the police, but he said that he was worried that they wouldn't believe him, wouldn't believe that he had acted in self-defense, and so he panicked and he drove Nikki's body to the area in Larch Mountain where he just ditched her. He pushed her body down an embankment area and just left her there. And then immediately afterwards, he effectively went on the run. As we know, he went to Ukraine. And he said that the reason for that was, again, because he was scared, and also because he felt as though he needed some time away to get sober. He had been drinking on the night that Nikki died, and I think he just drank a lot in general prior to this, and he believed that if he hadn't drank that night, he wouldn't have found himself in the situation that he was in. So yeah, that was partly the reason that he left, apparently, to get sober. And that was it. That was David Bogdanov's new story. And as I'm sure you can imagine, Nikki's friends and family and the prosecution were not buying this at all. They were not buying that this was a case of self-defense. One of the main reasons being because of the phone charger. Now, as I just said, David claimed that he originally just tried to use the phone charger to pull Nikki's shoulders back and restrain her, and that it just accidentally slipped up to her neck, causing her death. However, when this phone charger was found in Larch Mountain alongside her remains, as we know, it had like a clump of Nikki's hair extensions tangled up in it, and it was knotted at the top. It had actually been knotted 3 times. So that in itself disproves his account. He said that he just used this phone cord to hold Nikki back, but the knots indicate that it was secured tightly around her neck. And why else would he have knotted it 3 times if he didn't intend to kill her with it? I also think that it's important to note that when it was recovered, the phone cord had been tied to a width of approximately 3.97 inches. And according to Google, the average neck size, the average width of a neck is about 13 to 14 inches, which, I mean, just shows you how tightly this phone cord was pulled and secured around Nikki's neck. That is how much Nikki's neck was constricted, which is terrifying to think about. So I mean, how can he say that the charger just slipped up to her neck and accidentally strangled her to death during a violent struggle? It doesn't make any sense. And there's also the fact that he disposed of Nikki's body and went on the run afterwards. He claimed that he did that because he was scared, but if Nikki's death really was in self-defense, why didn't he just go to the authorities? That suggests that he had no remorse or felt no guilt whatsoever for what he had done. Well, in the prosecution's eyes, he didn't. He didn't feel remorse because they wholeheartedly believed that Nikki's death was in fact a hate crime. David Bogdanov decided to brutally kill her because she was transgender and because he did not approve of that lifestyle. To him, it was a sin. His trial came to a close in late August of 2021, and it actually took the jury about 2.5 days to deliberate and reach a verdict. So it was really looking like it could go either way or could result in a hung jury. But when they returned, they announced that they had found 27-year-old David Bogdanov guilty of the second-degree murder of 17-year-old Nikki Kuhnhausen, as well as malicious harassment. He was also found guilty of that too. He received a sentence of 19.5 years in prison for the murder charge, the maximum allowed under Washington state law for second-degree murder, and he received a further 12 months for the malicious harassment. And so, of course, that is where he remains today, in prison. Following Nikki's murder, her loved ones began campaigning for Nikki's Law to be passed in Washington state, which would essentially ban the use of the gay/trans panic defense in homicide or violent crime cases such as this one. For those who are unaware of what the gay/trans panic defense is, it's essentially a legal strategy that's been used many times by defense teams since around the 1950s to try and almost justify the actions of a murderer who has killed a member of the LGBTQ+ community. It's absolutely appalling, but they will basically try to argue that upon learning that the victim was homosexual or bisexual or trans or whatever, their client became so upset and angry because they do not approve of this lifestyle, and this causes them to almost become unable to control their actions. Yet they just unintentionally fly into a rage and kill them, but cannot be held responsible for what they've done because they panicked. Like I said, it's an appalling defense. I think it's disgusting that it's been used to try and justify someone killing another human being. But thankfully, Washington state is another state that has realized just how ludicrous this defense tactic is, and Nikki's Law was officially passed in 2020, just the year following her death. And that is it for this case. That is the case of Nikki Kuhnhausen. Nikki's story is just utterly tragic. She was literally a child, a 17-year-old girl with her whole future ahead of her. To think of all the things that she could have accomplished, you know, her dream of becoming a makeup artist for the stars, amongst many other things, and it was all cruelly snatched away from her. It's awful. But despite how horrific her death was, Nikki's story has had such a huge positive impact. It's made such a difference when it comes to trans rights in Washington state. Nikki's Law is her lasting legacy, and what an incredible legacy to have. But yeah, that is it for this case. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think, and also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. They can be solved cases, unsolved cases, serial killer cases, you name it. Again, you can pop them in the comments, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box too. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie.